Hey y'all, I am the world-renowned historian, and I'm here to talk to you today about the Tomb of Amphipolis. So I first heard about this back in like 2013, and I realized I hadn't looked for any updates since like right around that time. And what do you know? There's been some updates. People who don't study ancient history might wonder, like, what's the point of looking at ancient history? Like, we know the story. We've already found everything. We already know how it all ends. We found all there is to find. What could possibly be the point? Counterpoint, the Costa Tomb, aka the Amphipolis Tomb. So the Tomb of Amphipolis dates to the last few decades of the 4th century BCE, and the dig was begun in, any guesses? Come on. 2012? Be honest. Who had 2012? That is insane to me. The biggest tomb in all of ancient Greece, that we know of at least, sat undisturbed for 23 centuries before we dug it up. Now, granted, archaeologists were pretty sure there was something there like right around like the 1960s, but for some reason, we just forgot about it. More likely, they just didn't have funding to go dig it up. Now, granted, we really only started looking for this kind of stuff in like the 19th century when like these hobbyists and antiquarians would come out from like largely Great Britain, let's be honest, and go to these, Turkey or the Middle East and go start digging this stuff up. They all became very interested in ancient artifacts and history. After all, it was really only the late 18th century that Edward Gibbon kind of reinvented modern Roman history. And God only knows what got destroyed or corrupted due to, poor methodology or primitive archaeological technique or tools. Pour one out for all those mummies that got eaten by weird Victorians. So the Amphipolis tomb is 160 meters across and surrounded by a wall constructed of marble and limestone, which is 1,500 meters in circumference. The wall is very nearly perfectly intact. It is very, very close to a perfect circle. Now, we know that this marble is from the island of Thasos, and the wall, as I said before, is in absurdly perfect condition, given that it is almost 2,400 years old. It's really, frankly, staggering how well preserved it is. The only damage to the wall appears to be what had occurred in the 1930s when workers building a dam nearby took blocks from a partially exposed portion of it to help build that dam, not realizing what they found. Now, the hill of Costa, under which the tomb is located, was originally crowned by this gigantic lion figure. At some point, the lion was moved, and it was actually discovered in pieces on the banks of the Stramonis River back in 1912. They did put it back together, and we do know that it did originally crown the tomb. Now, including the base, this thing is 15 meters high. That is insane. That's about 10 feet higher than a standard American telephone pole. The tomb's proper entryway is flanked by statues of twin sphinxes, with about 5 feet of distance between them. The sphinxes themselves are about 7 feet high. The floor of the first chamber past the sphinxes is done fairly ingeniously. Like, it seems like the craftsman just took the little fragments and the bits left over from chipping the wall blocks and set them in red mortar to create this kind of like marble scattered pattern. It is here also where the craftsman installed a barrier wall of limestone protecting the tomb within. Also in the first chamber we find the Karyotids. Now, what is a Karyotid? Basically, it's just a fancy word to say like a load-bearing column that has been carved into the figure of a fair maiden. Including base, these figures are 12 feet tall. That is slightly less than 2 world-renowned historians. The second chamber contains a great deal of very intricate artwork, including this pictorial mosaic of Persephone being abducted by Pluto. And that guy in the front, that is Hermes, aka Mercury. And that is one sweet-ass hat, bruh. Side note, this was as far as the excavation had gotten the last time I checked in on it back in 2013. Now, there was once a marble door that stood between the second and third chambers, but unfortunately it was damaged in, the 23 centuries that it has existed. Perhaps, most intriguingly, here in the third chamber, we at last find some residents. Inside a burial trench in the third chamber were found the remains of 5 people. One, a woman over 60, an infant, fragments of a cremated adult, and then 2 adult men, both aged approximately 35 to 45. Who are these people? We still don't exactly know. The younger man, intriguingly, shows signs of unhealed, perhaps fatal wounds. Early speculation for the tomb's honoree was Alexander's mother, Olympias, or perhaps even Alexander himself. It is worth noting that we found the tomb of Alexander's father, Philip II, in the 1970s, and the tomb of Amphipolis absolutely dwarfs in size the tomb of Philip. Whoever it was for, they were very important. Now, even if it were for Alexander, it's pretty certain that it would not contain his actual remains, which we know were in the city of Alexandria in Egypt as late as the early Roman Empire. If you want the world-renowned historian's opinion, it's almost certain that Alexander's remains no longer exist, unless you count a little bit of dust in the bed of the Mediterranean Sea. Now, researchers are examining the DNA of the bodies, and by the way, how freaking cool is that that's even possible? But as it turns out, we have much easier, more readily available evidence for whom this tomb was constructed. The archaeologists working on the dig have discovered within the tomb the monogram of Hephaestion, Macedonian general, Alexander the Great's right-hand man, and some would argue probable lover. I am no expert on human sexuality and will venture no opinion on whether the two were lovers. There's plenty out there if you're interested in reading up on that. It is quite the debate. It's not hard to find. The important point here is that Alexander really liked Hephaestion. So just a bit of context. When Alexander was the age that most of us are graduating from uni and starting our first internship, Al the Great decided he wanted to conquer the shit out of the world, and he set his mind to a conquering. A conquering he went, doing well enough that he's pretty universally considered, I would say, I don't think this is controversial to say, one of the most influential people in human history. He got all the way to India, starting out from his house just north of modern-day Greece, and given that this was the 4th century BCE, I'd say that's pretty good. But that was where his men said that they'd had enough, so they turned back. Now this was in Ecbatana, then Medea, today modern-day Iran, that Alexander's beloved, best BFF, Hephaestion, died suddenly under very unclear circumstances. Al was absolutely devastated and was still planning huge monuments to his friend when Al himself followed his friend into the great beyond just a scant 8 months later. So it's completely believable that this was a monument to Hephaestion. Completed, yes, decades after Alexander's death, but completed pursuant to his will, presumably by his successors. We know that Hephaestion died in his 30s, but we don't know exactly how. The sources are very unclear. It seems possible to me that the younger man in the tomb is Hephaestion himself, though this would of course be very difficult to confirm. Again, it blows my mind that these giants of human history, we have their actual physical remains. Sometimes. Very rarely, but occasionally. I'm not the least bit impressed by King Tutankhamen. The only reason anyone cares about him is that his tomb was so well preserved. He was a very nothing, non-influential king. Philip II, though, potentially Hephaestion. That really blows my mind. Now, very intriguingly, there is a mound just to the west of Kasta that is much bigger, to the tune of 10 times bigger than the one housing the Amphipolis tomb. Now, might that be the monument to Alexander himself? Alright guys, that is the story of the Amphipolis tomb. Up to this point, I just wanted to make this short video for people, A, who'd never heard of this, ongoing developing story, maybe one of the most interesting historical stories that we'll see this century, but also because I honestly forgot about it for a few years and checked back in and there were some pretty cool updates. So if you're new here, like, comment, sub. I'll be keeping an eye on the updates on this dig from now on. Not sure if COVID knocked them off their workflow, but either way, if anything else develops, we will certainly discuss it here on this channel. This is the world-renowned historian for Long History Short. Be good, kiddos. I'm out.